Good evening. Welcome again. It's wonderful to have this turnout tonight. So as Neville Hode, my colleague, said, it's worth the wait, but thank you. Thank you for your patience. My name is Karen Engel, and I am a professor at the University of Texas School of Law. And along with Professor Neville Hode, who you got a glimpse of a moment ago in the English department, I co-direct the Bernard and Audrey Rappaport Center for Human Rights and Justice. So on behalf of the center and the Rothko Chapel in Houston, and with great appreciation to the Mishner Center, the Joins Reading Room, and the New Writers Project at UT, it is my great honor to welcome you this evening to the 10th Annual Francis Tarlton Sissy Farenthold Endowed Lecture in Peace, Social Justice, and Human Rights. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're meeting tonight on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, and to recognize the Alabama Cushado, Caddo, Caritza Como Crudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and other American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of the lands now known as Texas. We're privileged tonight to feature the highly acclaimed writer and public intellectual Viet Thanh Nguyen, whom Neville will introduce to you shortly. The title of Professor Nguyen's talk, as you know, is On Undefeated Despair, Writing Inside Empire. And I can imagine no one who would be more eager to hear from him than Sissy Farenthold, for whom this lecture is named. So tonight's lecture is a special one, not only because it marks a decade of a terrific collaboration with the Rothko Chapel, with whom we alternate venues for the lecture, but because Sissy would turn 100 this year. And so this event is also part of our year-long Sissy at 100 celebration. So for those of you who have not had the good fortune of knowing Sissy or her work, well, first of all, you can read a bio of her in the program. But I want to say a word. In short, she was, as her cenotaph in the Texas Cemetery puts it, a trailblazing Texan for a just, peaceful, and transparent world. To honor that work and ensure her legacy, the Rothko Chapel and the Rappaport Center, both organizations in which Sissy played an incredibly important role, came together while Sissy was still alive and very much involved to create the lecture, which was endowed by many of her friends whose names you can see on the back of the program. The lecture's purpose is to inspire audiences to think and act creatively to respond to some of the greatest challenges of the 21st century. And every year I note that's a high bar, but I will say in these times it seems higher than ever. And yet, Professor Nguyen is up for the task, and his presence tonight gives us an opportunity to appreciate Sissy's work that was highly critical of US intervention abroad, as well as its manifestations in the US. So for but one example, I'll just give you, on Inauguration Day in 1973, that was Nixon's second, Sissy spoke at the Houston Peace Rally. A ceasefire and planned US withdrawal from Vietnam had recently been announced. And Sissy made clear that even were the ceasefire to hold, it would not erase the years of violence and displacement that the US had wrought against millions in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And it would not end the other overt or covert operations we were conducting in numerous other countries, including, and I list advisedly, Iran, Lebanon, and Cuba. She then turned to what was happening inside the United States, including limits on the freedom of the press and the executive treating dissent as, quote, something very close to treason. And she drew the connections, and in the speech, she has it underlined for emphasis: we cannot remain a free republic at home and an arrogant empire abroad. Sissy liked to quote Gore Vidal for his reference to the United States of amnesia, and would often say, we learn nothing because we remember nothing. So more than 50 years after that speech in 1973, Viet Thanh Nguyen is here in part to connect with those, as he puts it, who also want to remember rather than to forget or distort. So I cannot possibly name all the people who have made this event happen, but I want to extend deep thanks to Cooper Christiancy, the Rappaport Center's Chief of Operations. Who got you all in the room. And he's been involved in every aspect of the lecture. He's been helped by all the center staff and students you've already seen tonight. And if you are in the room and not outside, will you stand up? So Cooper got you all in the room too. That's great. And especially, I want to recognize Maya Borchardt and Brianna Silva, if you all. And here. So of course, this event would not be what it is without the Rothko Chapel. And I'm very grateful to Kelly Johnson, who's here, Chief Engagement Officer, who has been involved in nearly every lecture from the beginning. And I'm also pleased to have here and welcome to the podium for the first time the Rothko Chapel's, I'm going to say relatively new president, 6 months, Abdullah Antepli, and whom we're very much looking forward to collaborating with, not only on this lecture, but in other ways in the years to come. So please join me in welcoming Abdullah to say a few words.
Thank you, Karen. Good evening, everyone. What a great pleasure and honor to be here. For those of you who have not heard or don't know much about Rothko Chapel, my elevator introduction of this very beautiful, sacred, almost magical art and education institution is, it says, contemplative meditative platform built by French Catholics by commissioning a Jewish American Latvian artist, Mark Rothko, and it is currently led by Turkish Imam, Muslim American. So in so many ways, on the surface level, you might think, what would a French Catholics or a Jewish American artist and a Turkish Muslim Imam would share in common? But we all almost come from the same fabric. All three of us are immigrants. All three of us are pushed away from our homeland. And we made this beautiful country home. The people who have been pushed out of their homeland in often violent ways, they are often like orphans. Like orphans, their connection to their origin is abruptly and often violently have been broken away from them. And most of us, we spend the rest of our lives trying to reconnect somehow, like our mothers. Just because somebody cut the umbilical cord many years ago, that connection doesn't disappear. And often, some of the privileged ones, like the three of the individuals involved in Rothko Chapel, because we came running away from disasters, wars, violences, in the countries that we came and privileged to have relative success, peace, we try to prevent future horrors so that the future generations is going to be prevented from the monsters that we have run away from. And that is Rothko Chapel. That was the Menils and Marco Rothko's, and now my life's calling and mission. How do you create a space where humanity thrives? How do you use the art as a tool, as a medium, that you inspire people for moral awakening that leads to moral action? That's our story. And as you heard, next year, this lecture series will be at Rothko Chapel. I did hope you will, as you came here and honored us tonight, you will come to next year's lecture as well and be part of it. And tonight's remarkable scholar and author have been exploring masterfully these identities, being a refugee, being an immigrant. How do you wake up, as Sissy beautifully said 50 years ago? I was born in 1973 when she gave that lecture. How do you learn from these past failures so that we are not going to repeat those mistakes moving forward? We are up for a scholarly, intellectual, and spiritual treat. Please join me now welcoming Professor Hogan to introduce our featured speaker. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
All right, I'm going to be brief. I wish to echo the thanks of Karen and Abdullah to all the people who made this evening possible. I also want to thank Karen and Abdullah for their leadership and stewardship in tough and rocky institutional times. And Cooper is our glue, and I'm always ecstatic to see Kelly and the staff and the students and the interns at the Rapport Center are actually like, keep me coming to work on days when I'd really rather not get out of bed. We are honored and grateful for Professor Viet Thanh Nguyen's delivery of the 10th annual Farenthold lecture on Undefeated Despair, Writing Inside Empire. I'm faced with an impossible task to introduce Professor Viet Thanh Nguyen to you succinctly, when I can imagine organizing a 15-week graduate seminar around the topics of his writing. So just be grateful I've spared you that. And I mean, this is writing which is characterized by extraordinary consistency and variety, subtlety and boldness, wit and passion, and complexity and directness across a staggering range of genres. His bio in your program offers some highlights. So if you haven't read, I just urge you to read and read a lot. Nguyen is a brilliant dialectical thinker on the intractable problems of political power and fairness, subjective feeling and public life, and the intimate dance between personal and official memory. I've been reading his work for years. I teach his 2015 Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Sympathizer, in an Introduction to World Literature class. I see a few of my, yes, I'm getting waves. Well done, thank you. While there could never be a single key to unlocking a writer, thinker, and advocate as powerful and careful as Viet Thanh Nguyen, his sustained engagement with the trope of the double may offer an opening. The figure of the double is everywhere in Nguyen's oeuvre. His memoir is entitled A Man of Two Faces. The opening sentence of The Sympathizer runs, I am a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of two faces. I'm reminded of another inaugural figuration of two-facedness, the Roman god Janus, who still lives with us every new year as we enter January. He is the god of beginnings, gates, transitions, time, duality, doorways, passages, frames, and endings. I'm glad I don't have to write the evaluation, the HR evaluation for that job description. He is usually depicted as having a head with two faces, one looking to the past, one to the future. I could riff further, but in short, I think Viet Thanh Nguyen's work may be something like a Janus for our time. The one face looks back to ensure we don't forget, but not to imprison us in ossified tradition. Instead, it looks back to help us imagine future remediations of past harms. Then the forward-looking face imagines futures unburdened by denial, disavowal, and repression. I could think of no one better equipped than the two faces of Professor Nguyen to get us to look both ways as we stand once again at the perilous crossroads of now. Okay, I'm going to do a tiny bit of housekeeping. This should be self-evident. If you want to ask a question, you know what to do with a QR code. And if you don't like QR codes like me, you can be old school and write it on this card, and we have a runner who will come and collect your question. And you can do it at any time as the thoughts come to you during the lecture. After the lecture and before the Q&A, Professor Kathy Schlund-Viles will join Professor Nguyen in conversation. A bit of her illustrious bio is also in the program. She is a leading scholar of the literature and culture of immigration, diaspora, and statelessness, as well as being actually probably one of my favorite colleagues, because she can be both entirely serious and hilarious at the same time. So there's a doubleness in there as well. We could not have hoped for a better interlocutor for this year's lecture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Thank you. That was fabulous. Well, thank you. That was a fabulous introduction, Neville. I really appreciate it. I was going to say that you would have the Janus-faced me here, but they thankfully took that one away. Thanks also to Abdullah and to Karen for hosting me tonight. Thanks to the Rappaport Center and to the Rothko Chapel, which sounds amazing, to that list of the French Catholic and the Jewish or American and the Turkish imam. You can add the atheistic Vietnamese Catholic refugee as well. And I'm grateful and I'm honored to be here to give the Sissy Farenthold lecture. I did know a little bit about her, but Karen, your contextualization of what she stood for, what she believed in, what she said was very, very moving to me. I think it took a lot of courage and a lot of insight for her to take these positions during the times that she did. A little bit of context for what I'm going to talk about tonight. I published a book last year called To Save and to Destroy, Writing as an Other. And this lecture is kind of a postscript or a sequel to that book. So I'll just briefly mention what that book is about. It's about the power of stories. And when I was growing up as a refugee in San Jose, California, stories saved my life. And there are probably many people here who love stories who would agree with me that stories save our lives. But if we give stories that power, we should acknowledge that stories also have the power to destroy us as well. And that's certainly been my experience growing up in the United States, witnessing what stories have done to me, what stories have enabled me to do, and what stories have powered this country as well. So that's the preface for the question that this lecture starts with, which is, what is the task of the writer living inside empire? I asked myself this question because it's important to name what my country is and therefore what I am. My opposition to empire not sufficient to absolve me of my complicity in empire. Not naming our country as an empire means helping to perpetuate it, even as some of us struggle to make life inside empire more humane. To what degree is that possible if the life of the nation is sustained by its existence as empire, by its periodic and perpetual slaughter of people in other countries beyond our horizon? Not naming our country as an empire allows us to ignore those deaths and to substitute more neutral terms like nation. We are a country. We are a nation with our stories, our legends, our mythologies that justify what we are. But we're also an empire, lubricated by the blood of others and running on the oil of others, albeit an empire staggering toward its fall. How long that fall will take is hard to predict. James Baldwin foresaw the end of Western empire in general since his Notes of a Native Son in 1955, when he wrote, "This world is white no longer, and it will never be white again." This was 1 year after the Vietnamese had defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu, signaling the mortal weakness of French empire. Anti-colonial and nationalist movements of liberation surged throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Baldwin had come back to the United States after 4 years in Paris from 1948 to 1952, where he had begun to think about how the terrors of racism, poverty, and homophobia that had driven him from the United States were inevitably linked to similar issues in France and its declining empire. He rose to fame in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s as a writer and a participant in the struggle for Black freedom. And like his friend, Martin Luther King Jr., his journey would lead to increasing radicalization. If by radicalization one means the ever-increasing capacity to see how one's own campaign for freedom is connected to those of others. Empire opposes this radicalization. The imperial powers compete with each other, but they also work with similar strategies to divide and to conquer, to discourage those they control from forming solidarities with other oppressed peoples. By 1967, however, King, in his prophetic speech Beyond Vietnam, saw that Black freedom was inseparable from ending what he saw as a racist, militarist, and capitalist war in Southeast Asia, where black men were being sent in what he called a brutal solidarity with white men to kill Vietnamese people. By 1969, King was assassinated. By 1971, Baldwin, in his book No Name in the Street, was also explicit about the global reach of racist empire and about how the inside and outside of empire intertwined. Of the Black Panthers, he wrote that nothing more thoroughly reveals the actual intentions of this country, domestically and globally, than the ferocity of the repression, the storm of fire and blood, which the Panthers have been forced to undergo merely for declaring themselves as men who want land, bread, housing, education, justice, and peace. The Panthers thus became the native Viet Cong. The ghetto became the village in which the Viet Cong were hidden, and in the ensuing search and destroy operations, everyone in the village became suspect. No Name in the Street is my favorite of Baldwin's works, for his mood, bleak and pessimistic, registers with mine in the long sunset of empire. There's no uplifting rhetoric in No Name in the Street, no audacity of hope, the title of Barack Obama's 2006 memoir, whose subtitle was Thoughts on Reclaiming the American Dream. In Baldwin, there is little sense of those words of King that Obama liked to quote. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Perhaps the gravitational pull of justice exists, but if it does, justice requires the end of empire. If the American dream is inseparable from American empire, then what would justice look like for the United States? And are Americans willing to pay the price of that ticket for justice? Baldwin himself was scornful of the word justice. Albert Camus, he wrote, sorry. That was the voice of God or Siri. Albert Camus, spoke of justice in Algeria when the real issue was that Algerians were not fighting the French for justice, but for the power to determine their own destinies. The implication is that those in power get to define what is just and unjust, while the rhetoric of justice without a meaningful transfer of power from the more powerful to the less powerful is an empty rhetoric. Such a transfer of power seems unlikely without violence. Not necessarily violence on the part of the less powerful, but almost certainly violence on the part of the more powerful. Of this, Baldwin was clear when he wrote that there will be bloody holding actions all over the world for years to come, but the Western Party is over, and the white man's sun has set, period. 1971 was also the year I was born, in the middle of one of those holding actions described by Baldwin, a war that was never actually declared by the United States. King also foresaw a future of relentless war and protest. For, in his words, the war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. And if we ignore this sobering reality, we will find ourselves organizing clergy and laymen concerned committees for the next generation. They will be concerned about Guatemala and Peru. They will be concerned about Thailand and Cambodia. They will be concerned about Mozambique and South Africa. We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end unless there is a significant and profound change in American life and policy. King's position was not a popular one in the United States, and even among fellow Black rights activists and leaders who thought that war and civil rights were separate issues. Likewise, No Name in the Street elicited mixed responses, such as this one from Mel Watkins, the first Black editor of the New York Times Sunday Book Review. For Watkins, Baldwin's political analysis is a rhetorical web of damnation of European and American politics. The moral rectitude is unquestioned, yet for the most part, the ideological discourse is too abstract and facile or too obvious to impress. Watkins adopts a dismissive tone towards Baldwin's politics, and yet by the end of the review, Watkins concedes that the book may very well be a more serious indictment against ourselves, a palpable indication of our own. I don't understand. I'm going to give you this one, please. All right, I've had enough of Siri. Okay. That's something my 12-year-old son would normally do when he comes to attend my lectures. It's a palpable indication of our own moral degeneration, Watkins says. The responses to King and Baldwin in their more radical mode of solidarity and prophecy, even from their Black peers, indicates that living within empire does not necessarily mean that one does not understand that empire exists. Rather, one is aware and yet ignores that existence. One glimpses the operations of empire out of the corner of one's eye and then moves on. Empire is so obvious that to point it out is unnecessary. For what is one to do about it? Is noticing and pointing out the workings of empire simply tiresome, even when those workings take place in the open and shamelessly? Let's return to Baldwin's Paris of the 1950s during the era of transition between French Empire and American Empire. Baldwin goes to Paris not with romance in his eyes, the kind of American infatuation with France that's also an infatuation with imperial power, either at its height or in the moment of its nostalgia, repeated endlessly until we arrive in Emily in Paris. I prefer Baldwin in Paris, so much so that I placed a sequel to my novel, The Sympathizer, in Paris and called it The Committed. Baldwin's experiences in the 1950s and those of other Black writers, intellectuals, and artists from the United States and France's colonies throughout the early to mid-20th century were very much on my mind. The Committed is set in the early 1980s and in the refugee and immigrant enclaves of Paris, where a shared history of colonization and racism might produce rivalry and antagonism as much as solidarity and identification. I set the plot of The Committed as a contrast between two worlds, the philosophers and the intellectuals of Paris on the one hand, and the gangsters and the criminals on the other. The philosophers and intellectuals are white, with the assimilated Vietnamese and Cambodians on their side. The gangsters and the criminals are Arabs, Algerians, and Senegalese, with an anomalous gang of Vietnamese and ethnic Chinese threatening to disrupt the social, political, and racial divisions of a French metropolitan world that's irrevocably shaped by colonialism. My half-French, half-Vietnamese protagonist traffics between the two worlds, becoming a gangster and selling drugs to the philosophers and intellectuals. Two young Algerian gangsters and drug dealers threaten him for encroaching on their business. He responds by trying to persuade them that the Indo-Chinese and the Algerians belong on the same side. For the absolutely real truth here was that these two should have called me brother or cousin or maybe uncle, because we were related, our mutual ancestors being the Gauls, who had the gall to call us their descendants, with Algerians the oldest sons, while we Indo-Chinese were the gifted middle children, destined to be clerks, assistants, adjutants, and minor bureaucrats, unlike the Cambodians and the Laotians, and so on, down the empire's chain of being. each of us clinging to a link as we looked up towards the red cheeks of the slightly less oppressed simian above us, yearning for a benevolent white hand to help us claw past the undeserving creatures in our way and onto that beautiful battleship named La Mission Civilisatrice, which had shelled Haiphong and killed 6,000 civilians, but who's counting? We were just natives who did not count. The end of the Committed coincides with a real-life historic March of the Arabs, or the March for Equality and Against Racism in 1983. I was happily surprised to discover a black and white photograph documenting a contingent of Vietnamese in the march, led by 3 young men wearing white masks. Later, a participant in the march told me those masks were actually yellow, but appeared white in the photograph. I put that detail and the photo into the Committed, just as I put quotations from Frantz Fanon into the text, as my protagonist debates the meaning of revolution and violence and nonviolence with himself and his fellow colonized peoples in Paris. The reception of the Committed seems divided between those readers for whom the eruption of real history, real theory, and real politics in the novel is thrilling, which is the right reaction, and other readers for whom such appearances of the real disrupt the seamlessness of the plot. Power, in general, and imperialism and colonialism in particular want seamlessness, want a naturalization of an unjust world order from which the empire benefits. To disrupt that kind of seamlessness is an art in and of itself, deforming the empire in a way that the empire interprets as a deformation of art. The recent case of director Wim Wenders at the Berlinale Film Festival illustrates the kind of seamlessness that dominant institutional power prefers. Wenders, the festival director, responded to a question about the genocide in Gaza by saying, "We have to stay out of politics, because if we make movies that are dedicatedly political, we enter the field of politics. But we are the counterweight of politics. We are the opposite of politics. We have to do the work of people, not the work of politicians." This was a strange, even illogical comment, for in Wenders' 1998 book, The Logic of Images, he wrote that every film is political. Most political of all are those that pretend not to be entertainment movies. They are the most political movies there are because they dismiss the possibility of change. In every frame, they tell you everything's fine the way it is. They are a continual advertisement for things as they are. Wenders is opposed to the implicit political content of mainstream entertainment, which can normalize the atrocious. These are the most political films. And he is also at least sometimes opposed to the explicit politics of political movies when they are badly done, as when he later says that a lot of political films treat their characters like marionettes. From this, it appears that Wenders is not enthused about bad political movies because they endorse bad politics or because they are bad aesthetically, which I agree with. But he doesn't give much of a clue as to what is a good political movie, and yet they must exist, as every film is political. How does one square that comment with his saying that we have to stay out of politics? If someone had asked Wenders about the Holocaust, I am sure that he and everyone else at the Berlinale would have had an opinion. As Omar El-Akkad has so eloquently written in his book of the same title, one day, everyone will have always been against this when it comes to atrocities, war crimes, and genocides that are long concluded. To be against the Holocaust is to be safely political, to exist in the same realm as the entertainment movies that Wenders decries. But to declare that Israel, what it is doing in Gaza, the West Bank, and Palestine as genocidal is to be explicitly political, to go against the logic and the norm of power. Wenders is not unique, but typical of the artist within empire, where an intentional politics in art can only be exercised retrospectively when there are no costs to the artist or to the empire for doing so. This is one reason why No Name in the Street does not rank among the sentimental favorites of Baldwin's work among imperial readers, for it addresses the politics as they happen and as they still happen even decades later. Baldwin is allowed to notice the failures of empire that concern him as a Black American man, hence his status as a civil rights hero. This is the logic of images for a subordinated subject, to notice only what is done to people like him. He is not supposed to notice what does not concern him, the plight of Arabs and Algerians who are neither Black nor American. They should not count, and yet they do for Baldwin, which is, from the stance of power, illogical. The early 1950s are a tense time in Paris, particularly for Algerians and Arabs and the way they are treated by the police. Baldwin says that the attitude of the police, which had always been menacing, began to be yet more snide and vindictive. This puzzled me at first, but it shouldn't have. This is the way people react to the loss of empire. For the loss of an empire also implies a radical revision of the individual identity. And I was to see this over and over again, not only in France. The Arabs were not a part of Indochina, but they were part of an empire, visibly and swiftly crumbling, and part of a history which was achieving, in the most literal and frightening sense, its denouement, was revealing itself, that is, as being not at all the myth with which the French had made of it. And the French authority to rule over them was being more hotly contested with every hour. The decline of the French Empire, about to be hastened by the French defeat in Indochina and then in Algeria, continues until this day. France still has colonial territories and pockets of influence, although it is a second or third-rate power by now. The hatred of Algerians and Arabs that Baldwin observes also continues shaping contemporary French politics and the steady rise of the far right, which finds its roots in the Algerian defeat and the expulsion of French settlers back to France. The language of replacement theory was articulated first in France, this idea that the Muslims are here and more are coming. The individual manifestation of such phobia and fear-mongering is manifest in the casual and state violence directed against Arabs. Baldwin writes that, "I had watched the police one sunny afternoon beat an old, one-armed Arab peanut vendor senseless in the streets. And I'd watched the unconcerned faces of the French on the cafe terraces and the congested faces of the Arabs." What Baldwin witnessed was not anomalous. Half a century later, perhaps not far away from where Baldwin saw this scene, I witnessed a Black man being beaten by white French police officers in the tourist area of Les Halles in central Paris, on the sidewalk in front of a cafe full of what seemed to be mostly white patrons. The French police in Baldwin's time, and 50 years later, appear unconcerned to have witnesses. The police appear to assume that what they did to a Black man might be seen, but would also not be seen at the same time. In the same way that Israel has been able to inflict continual violence on Palestinians, much of it well documented, much of it seen, and yet unseen until October 7th and its aftermath. One question for writers inside empire, as it is for everyone inside empire, is when to take notice. A few years after Baldwin noticed the beating of the Arab peanut vendor, the writer Marguerite Duras observed something similar in a piece titled The Algerian's Flowers from 1957. The encounter takes place in the Emily in Paris type of neighborhood of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where Duras sees two men in plain clothes arrest an Algerian who sells illegally, as he lives, flowers. The flower vendor has no papers. The plainclothesman upset his cart of flowers. Here, Duras, a screenwriter as well as a novelist and essayist, introduces her own logic of images. Eisenstein isn't there, nor any others, to spot the images of these flowers on the ground, regarded by the young Algerian man of 20 years, framed on each side by the representatives of French order. One woman denounces the Algerian as scum and lauds the policeman, the plainclothesman. But another woman picks up some of the flowers and pays the Algerian. Then 4 more women, then 15 do the same, after which, Duras writes, there isn't a single flower on the ground. After which, these men had the time to take the young Algerian to the police station. If it seems that nothing has changed nearly 70 years later and many thousands of miles away from Paris, where ICE, Homeland Security, and Customs and Border Patrol are snatching people off the streets, then it is because nothing has changed. The replacement theory that holds France in its grip, and the United States as well, is the rasp of a dying empire. The worst was yet to come for the French and the Algerians, both in Paris and in Algeria. Meanwhile, Duras was a resistance fighter during World War II and for a time a member of the Communist Party. She would soon go on to write the screenplay for Hiroshima Mon Amour in 1959, which features a brief, intense affair between a nameless couple, a white French woman and a Japanese man in Hiroshima, where the woman is there to play a role in a movie about peace in the wake of the atomic bombing by the United States. In her notes to the screenplay, Duras writes that how they met will not be revealed in the picture, for that is not really what matters. Chance meetings occur everywhere in the world. What is important is what these ordinary meetings lead to. We all have chance encounters within empire, each of which is a potential moment to pay attention, to notice, to take action, consider our ethical obligations to the other, to reconsider our history, or to refuse any such recognition or acknowledgement. Baldwin traveled to Paris for his chance encounters with Arabs and Algerians, who helped to expand his view of how his blackness was inseparable from imperialism and colonialism. Most of us do not even have to leave our cities to meet those people who have been brought to us within empire, carried here by the circuits created by the displacements of our empire, our wars, our bombings, our coups, our interventions. This was true for Duras on the street of one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Paris, but what helps to make her unique was her origin. Duras was born in 1914 near Saigon and spent most of her childhood and adolescence in French Indochina in the early 20th century, feeling out of place. As a white girl among mostly Vietnamese, Chinese, and Cambodian people, she had the racial privilege of white supremacy. But she was also a poor white child among the French colonizing community, with its class hierarchy and social protocols, in which her troubled family had a scandalous reputation. Her time in the Indochinese colonies as someone both inside and outside French Empire seems to have left an indelible imprint on her 2 best-known works, the screenplay for Hiroshima Mon Amour and the 1984 novel, The Lover. Both deal with transgressive love affairs between a white girl or young woman and an Asian man. In The Lover, a 15-year-old white girl on a ferry has a chance encounter with a wealthy Chinese man 12 years her senior and begins a long and scandalous affair with him. The Girl on the Ferry is at least partly autobiographical, and the allure of the lover arises from the implication that the novel's events really did happen to Duras. The lover's continuing power comes from how Duras and the girl inhabit the abjectness that is stigmatized by proper French, Vietnamese, and Chinese society. Shameless. That's what we were, the girl says of her family. But while her family is ashamed of what others see as their humiliating conditions, the girl coolly and defiantly wears the approbation. Suddenly, I see myself as another, she says of herself on the ferry, as another would be seen, outside myself, available to all eyes, in circulation for cities, journeys, desire. She sees herself, we see her, he sees her, we see him, and so the chain of gazes goes. The novel makes our eyes follow this chain and through it to feel desire, the desire for the other, whoever that other is. Whether we can articulate it or not, we sense that desire comes about precisely from the difference between ourselves and the other, even if that other is our own self. One gets the feeling that for Duras and the girl, the journey into their own interiors, their own otherness, is the longest journey of all. For the girl, the willingness to make that journey is one sign that gives her, she says, the certainty that later on I'll be a writer. The certainty of becoming a writer, the desire for the other, the awareness of the gaze, the willingness to be shameless. Duras shares all this with Baldwin, along with the willingness to exploit plot and setting in order to illuminate romance and vice versa. So it is that in Hiroshima Mon Amour, Duras and the director Alain Resnais blur the line between documentary, history, and fiction. Historical footage of the Hiroshima bombing and its consequences, and a recreation of the effects of the bomb on survivors mix with images of the affair between this anonymous French woman who has come to Hiroshima to make a movie about peace and the nameless Japanese architect. The banality of their love affair, Duras says, is transformed by the impossibility of talking about Hiroshima, whose setting means that the spectator should come away purged of practically all prejudice. Close-ups of their naked and entwined bodies in the opening images depict them being showered and smeared with the falling ash of atomic death, Duras writes. The hair that falls out from the heads of Japanese women who survived the bombing foreshadow the story that the French woman will later tell her Japanese lover about how during World War II and the German occupation of France, she, as a teenager, fell in love and had an affair with a German soldier. The resistance kills him, and she has her head shaved by her neighbors for loving an official enemy of her country. But it isn't the affair that is the crime for Duras. Rather, it is the shaving of the woman's head, which Duras calls the ultimate of horror and stupidity. The film the French woman is starring in is a well-intentioned movie about peace, but Duras dismisses it as not necessarily a ridiculous film, merely an enlightening one. The love stories, the scandalous love stories, are more compelling for her, featuring as they do a woman who says, "I have doubtful morals." Her doubtful morals are not only about her sexuality, but about her betrayal of the nation and the empire when she had an affair with the enemy. The young girl in The Lover likewise betrays her family and her race when she has an affair with a Chinese man. Duras ties together nationality, race, loyalty, and sexuality to imply that morality is not simply an individual matter, but a patriotic one. Nationalism and patriotism require the morality of loyalty, as we see today, which Duras was willing to engage in when she fought with the resistance against Nazi occupation. But she also recognized that a rigid morality was a problem, just as a rigid nationalism and patriotism aligned with racism were problems. In all these cases, infidelity is both a political and a sexual matter, even more so with an interracial love affair. For writers as well, there is the question of fidelity. One should always be faithful to one's art, and an infidelity to one's art is a real betrayal. But infidelity to the racism and imperialism and the nationalism that requires them, that seems to be desirable for writers like Baldwin and Duras, writing within empires and against empires simultaneously. Empires, nations, and families often enforce the demand for loyalty, with an allegation that being disloyal is a shameful act. This is why Duras's shamelessness, exhibited through her life and her writing, is so refreshing. Some readers might think that the most shocking part of The Lover is the spectacle of a young girl claiming her sexuality, but perhaps what is most unsettling is the sight of this girl getting old by the end of the book and becoming powerful not through her sexuality and her beauty, but through her writing, a writing that is from beginning to end shameless. Baldwin, too, was learning how to be shameless as he grew in his power as a writer. Much has been made of sexuality and desire in his writing and life, but I turn here to another aspect of his writing, inside and against empire and its morality, that has been less discussed, and that is his argument against Israel. Baldwin had visited Israel in 1961, and by 1971, he had drawn this conclusion. Any real commitment to Black freedom in this country would have the effect of reordering all our priorities and altering all our commitments so that, for horrendous example, we would be supporting Black freedom fighters in South Africa and Angola and would not be allied with Portugal, would be closer to Cuba than we are to Spain, would be supporting the Arab nations instead of Israel, and would never have felt compelled to follow the French into Southeast Asia. Israel, Baldwin said, was a state created for the purpose of protecting Western interests. He was rephrasing what had already been said in 1896 by Theodor Herzl in his essay, The Jewish State, the blueprint for the founding of modern Israel. It would be, Herzl said, a rampart of Europe against Asia, serving as an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. The empire that Baldwin and Duras were writing against in mid-century extends eventually to Israel as its easternmost border today. The struggle against empire is enormous. On realizing the scale of this task of liberation and decolonization, how it exceeds any individual, one might feel despair. This is where I find inspiration in the writer John Berger, who found inspiration in the Palestinians. On visiting Palestine in 2006, 2 years after the death of Yasser Arafat and the year of Hamas's electoral victory in Gaza, Berger describes scenes that could be happening now. Everywhere one goes in Palestine, even in rural areas, one finds oneself amongst rubble, picking a way through, around, and over it. The rubble is of houses, roads, and the debris of daily lives. There's scarcely a Palestinian family that has not been forced during the last half century to flee from somewhere, just as there's scarcely a town in which buildings are not regularly bulldozed by the occupying army. There's also the rubble of words that house nothing anymore, whose sense has been destroyed. Notoriously, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, as the Israeli army is called, has become de facto an army of conquest, Berger says. Berger predicts that violent repression will generate an unpredictable response. The Palestinians have tried both violence and nonviolence and have been met with violence regardless. For Israel, there is, Berger says, a refusal to see immediate consequences. For example, the wall and the annexation of still more Palestinian land cannot promise security for the state of Israel. It recruits martyrs. For example, if a kamikaze martyr could see with her own eyes before dying the immediate consequences of their explosion, they might well reconsider the appropriateness of their steadfast decision. The mantra that Berger repeats throughout his essay as he describes Palestinian endurance is to say that each act of life and survival that he witnesses is what he calls the stance of undefeated despair. Undefeated despair follows in the lineage of Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, to describe just how much hope one can have in confronting a power that seems overwhelming. The audacity of hope is for politicians, but undefeated despair is for the colonized, who have endured multiple generations and decades of oppression and violence. Undefeated despair is also an apt description of the work of certain kinds of writers. I am uninterested in optimistic writers and in writers who project a brand of success which fits the capitalistic interests of empire and the large portion of the literary industry that supports empire. I am called on by writers for whom there is a recognition that the writing that matters emerges from the undefeated despair of knowing that the task of writing is never done, that the best fate for a writer is to die writing. Even more, I am drawn to those writers for whom undefeated despair is also the only recourse, because they know they write inside empire and are committed to writing against empire. Baldwin seems to express something akin to undefeated despair when he concludes No Name in the Street by saying, "This book is not finished, can never be finished by me." But if the book cannot be finished, it is also the case that empire did not finish off Baldwin or Duras or, my last example, Emil Habibi, author of what Edward Said called the greatest of Palestinian novels, The Secret Life of Said, the Pesoptimist, from 1974. Said is a Palestinian living in Israel who, in a series of strange, surreal letters, describes life from the Nakba of 1948 to the early 1970s, from the refugee expulsions and the erasure of villages to submission under Israel. Said is not a hero. He is instead a collaborator with the Israeli state, the son of an informant and a confused anti-communist. But his willingness to collaborate with the Israeli authorities does not save him. Near the end of the book, when he hears on Radio Israel that defeated Arabs should raise white flags of surrender over their homes, he is happy to do so in Haifa. Unfortunately for him, the Israeli authorities interpret his patriotism as subversion. The radio, he is told, was telling the West Bank Arabs to raise white flags of surrender to the Israeli occupation. What did you think you were up to? Doing that in the very heart of the state of Israel, in Haifa, which no one regards as a city under occupation. It's an indication that you do regard Haifa as an occupied city and are therefore advocating its separation from the state. The absurdity of Said's situation is amplified when he is sent to a terrifying Israeli prison where he makes the mistake of quoting Shakespeare to the guards. They beat him ruthlessly, and before he passes out, he hears them say, "Welcome 1,000 times, our very own Shakespeare." Reading The Secret Life of Said, the Pesoptimist, was an occasionally eerie experience for me because, like Said, the protagonist of my novels, The Sympathizer and The Committed, is no hero, but a double agent, someone akin to an informer and a collaborator, depending on who's looking at him. Like Said, who compares himself and his unlikely misadventures to those of Candide, my protagonist is put through enormous travails in 2 novels on a journey that I thought of as Candidian. Like Said, my protagonist ends up in a prison at the end of The Sympathizer, tortured for knowing too much, for being too smart for his own good. My protagonist eventually ends up in a mental asylum at the end of The Committed, which is also where Said's journey ends after prison. Like Said, this writer of strange letters to a reader who is assumed to know the history of Palestine and Israel and the Nakba, my protagonist writes his occasionally surreal confessions from the prison and the asylum to a reader who is assumed to know the history of Vietnam, war, and colonialism. The eeriness in the parallels is simply an effect of parallel lives and parallel histories of the Vietnamese and the Palestinians under empire, which compels responses ranging from violent revolution to undefeated despair. The pressure of empire, Said says, is suffocating. His own son becomes a guerrilla fighting against Israel because he wants to breathe free, to breathe in freedom just once. I thought immediately of Fanon, who wrote in Black Skin, White Masks that it is not because the Indo-Chinese has discovered a culture of his own that he is in revolt. It is because, quite simply, it was in more than one way becoming impossible for him, the Indo-Chinese, to breathe. As Baldwin is unable to finish his book, Said's story trails off, disappears in the mental hospital where the gentleman who received his letters has gone to find him. This too struck me because before I had even had the chance to read The Secret Life of Said the Piss Optimist, I had planned to end the 3rd novel of my trilogy about my sympathizer with his disappearance. Like Baldwin, he will not be able to finish his own story. Someone else will. My sympathizer was a man of 2 faces and 2 minds, able to see any issue from both sides, a duality produced by colonization, which finds its match in Said's question: which am I, a pessimist or an optimist? The answer for Emil Habibi is to be a pes-optimist, an invented word which indicates that the writer living inside empire has to find a new language and a new form, a seemingly impossible task that must be made possible through the stance of undefeated despair. Thank you so much. And I'm just absolutely thrilled and overjoyed to be here with Kathy Schillen-Viles, who I've known for a very, very long time. Yeah.
I think you have to.
I'll sit right there. Yeah. Thanks for doing this, Kathy.
Oh, gosh, no, thank you. Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me? I'm not the star, but, and it's such a privilege to be here, and I really want to express my gratitude to all the folks that made this possible. This is just lovely. And as Viet indicated, while I was bent down awkwardly looking at your eye, like your watch thing, we've known each other for a long time. So it's in that spirit that I'm gonna open with a question, and we envision this to be kind of on the shorter side because I'm sure you have a lot of questions. But what was really quite striking is that you raise a question about writers in empire, and that question is when to take notice. And I want to take us back in time to 2016, which is when you happened to win the Pulitzer Prize. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
Okay. I know. I hope to return to this. So in the year that you won the Pulitzer, obviously Brexit happened. Donald Trump was elected. The United Nations Security Council happened to adopt a resolution Resolution 2334 condemning Israeli settlements in Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. The majority of US troops were withdrawn from Afghanistan, signaling the end, almost, of the war on terror. And the Chicago Cubs won the World Series, which for some signaled the apocalypse because that had not been done since 1908. The question that I want to ask or kind of begin with is that you mentioned revolution, which can be about transformation and change, but it can also be returning to the same space. So in 2016, when the Sympathizer is really gaining a lot of traction and you are now, ushered into this public intellectual space, was that a time when you took notice? Or when did taking notice occur for you?
I think I was always taking notice because I always noticed that people were noticing me. I was this little Vietnamese refugee boy in San Jose, California, and even at a very young age, in the single digits, my classmates were making jokes to me about the Vietnam War. These were just little kids, right? Mm-hmm. And so that aspect of war in the history of the United States was always around me. Now, no one would call that empire at the time, or even now, but for me, my growth as a writer and a professor, a scholar, but also I think as a human being, is to make increasing connections, as I try to do in this paper, between our own individual plights, whatever those happen to be, and the particular traumas that we feel about history with other experiences. Because for me, it was very definitely true that I was expected to know about the Vietnam War, about Vietnam. I mean, you've probably served as personal tour guides to people, right? They'll meet you and it's like, oh, we had this great trip to Vietnam or this great trip to Cambodia and so on. So we're expected to know our territory because that is where the empire's subjects come from. But I think we're expected to know a relatively limited version of that history. And I certainly felt that with the Sympathizer because, and here, this is where that book becomes relevant to the topic tonight, which is that when I wrote the novel, it was very clear that it was going to be marketed as a Vietnam War novel. As Baldwin has a niche that he's put into, so a Vietnamese American writer is put into the niche about the Vietnam War. But in my mind, it was about the Vietnam War, but about the Vietnam War as part of a larger episode. I mean, as an episode of a larger history of empire and imperialism and perpetual war. That's hard to put into a soundbite. Doesn't really roll off the tongue, and it's not good marketing. Okay, so for me, when it won the Pulitzer Prize, I was a little confounded, but it also made total sense because we give prizes not because we want to deny that things have happened, but I think we are trying to take notice, but in some ways the notice can also be a containment as well. So we can notice something, but what do we do with that notice? I think that's part of the implication of this essay. Taking notice is important, but what we do with that is just as important, if not more than. And so that was why it was always necessary for me in the aftermath to think I had to write the sequel, The Committed, and not set it in Vietnam, and not set it in the United States. And that was very confusing for a lot of readers. What is a Vietnamese American doing writing a novel set in France? And likewise, the part I did not get to include in this essay is that the success of the Sympathizer globally, because it has about 30 editions, is tied to American empire. This is one of the paradoxes. There are Vietnamese writers who write about war, empire, about many of the things I've talked about, but it's very difficult for them to get translated and published outside of Vietnam. But a Vietnamese American writing in the United States about a problematic war for the United States gets a recognition, and then that gets circulated globally. That is to be a writer who's already, even as I imagine that the work is critical of empire, the writer's already captured within empire as well. So it's those kind of complications that I think that Baldwin was not able to escape either, and which I was interested in exploring.
Well, and just I know that I'm not sure how the questions will be conveyed, but I did want to make sure we had time for questions. But I did have a question, and perhaps I'm expecting too much from you because we know each other. Hashtag humble brag, but. And I was really struck. I think that this particular articulation is so relevant, and actually punctured for a brief moment while you were speaking the despair that was not undefeated on my end. But I wonder, though, what do you tell somebody who understands that undefeated despair is aspirational, but right now it seems that what we're all facing, or perhaps I'm facing, I'm projecting here, is a profound sense of unrelenting resignation and grief. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious because as a writer, you have, like, I was really struck by like the ability to kind of not only name something, but to kind of write your way out, some, connection to power. But I'm not there, and I think that so many people are not there. So what would you tell us to maybe, in terms of turning that frown upside down? I don't think it's that facile, but you know what I'm getting at, right?
Are you saying, though, that you personally feel the despair but not the undefeated part? Was that
Absolutely.
The
that was such a more succinct way of putting it.
Well, I think that, to feel despair is to be realistic. I mean, I think that to not feel despair is to not have an accurate assessment of the situation that we find ourselves in the United States and globally. So I think despair is actually a good sign. If you were going around thinking, hey, everything's going to be okay with the next election, there's a problem. Then you have a problem of analysis, and you're probably sheltered in some way from the consequences of what's happening and what will happen. To me, actually, I find great inspiration, as I said here, in the undefeated part, because it implies that, in fact, the struggle goes on for a very long time. And if we look at our history, if we look at Duras, we look at Baldwin, we look at many kinds of anti-colonial writers and writers who've worked on the liberation struggles, they've had their moments of victory, which is great. That's how we have moved forward as a country. But then there's been these moments of enormous defeat. And we are being rolled back a century or a century and a half in terms of the progress that the country has made. So I'm not sure I have an answer to your question, because I actually feel motivated by the idea that people have not been defeated. Now, have they had total victory? No, far from it. And the wider that our sense of our campaign for liberation gets, the more difficult that task becomes. But I have to say that, when we started off as being friends and colleagues, I was not thinking about Palestine. I was very much focused domestically in the United States, and then, to the extent I was internationally concerned, it was really about wars in Asia. So to think about Palestine on top of that, you could say, well, that just adds another burden to an already overburdened sense of despair. But in actuality, I have found it to be actually enormously invigorating, not to diminish the situation that Palestinians are facing, but to recognize that as the Palestinians themselves have insisted that they have endured against much greater odds than the average American. That to me is inspirational, actually. So I think, partly when I talk about examples outside the United States, is to point out the fact that we in the United States, some of us may feel despair without an adjective, but we don't have a right to. And that's why it's important to expand our campaign and to see different situations where the impact of American empire has been actually much more brutal and much more violent, even than it has been within the United States. And if other peoples have endured and have, organized themselves continuously, then so can we.
Thank you. And I will shift to a question here, but what's really striking is that perhaps the United States is a unique place given histories of immigration, histories of refugees. There's so many stories of despair, yet people remain undefeated. And maybe that's where the opening for getting out of this despairing depression that is facing so many of us. So
I have to say that the optimism of the Obama years was Panglossian. If we go back to the Voltaire reference in Candide, it was sort of unwarranted in some ways. It didn't fully recognize the structural and deep rootedness of the problems that we face. And then I think some people look at Trump and think this is an aberration in American history, and I think Trump is the realization of American history. As much as Obama is, so is Trump. And I've referred to both of them as, Obama as the quiet American and Trump as the ugly American.
Yeah.
But they're both Americans. And if we're talking about the Janus-faced, quiet American and ugly American, those are two Cold War novels. They give you the Janus-faced elements of American imperial power. and Obama was an imperial president. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't like him for other aspects, but the quiet American and the ugly American are two different ways of making American empire operate. And so both of them are outcomes of the fundamental contradiction within the United States that is the basis of this country.
And in brilliant fashion, you brought this all the way back to the beginning of the first question I asked, which is that 2016 moment. Because you did actually articulate during your talk the idea that we shouldn't be complacent thinkers. We shouldn't really embrace complacent writers. And I think that is what I'm looking back. If I had to do a postmortem of 2016, it was that Obama high of like complacency, right? That nothing bad could ever happen. And then when faced with Trump, it's just absolutely stunning, right? Like, and it knocks you down. And so I feel a bit better now. I'm glad. Thanks. But speaking in an emotional, like continuing in an emotional vein, could you talk more about the ambivalence? I know this is going to be awkward, of desire and love after I just talked about my depression, but can you talk more about the ambivalence of desire and love and how they support or resist empire?
Desiring love, right? Well, in reading No Name in the Street, there wasn't really that much of an opportunity to talk about, Baldwin's queerness and his affairs and how important his desiring life was to his politics. But that's why Duras is so interesting for me, because I think it's easy possibly to look at a writer like Duras and to sort of not dismiss her, but sort of overlook the importance of her political positions, because for her and the way that she's able to articulate what she's doing, it's actually incredibly important, the personal transgression. Now, the personal transgression by itself is not enough, right? But for Duras, she is able to put the personal interracial transgressions that she uses as material for her writing, she is able to put them into an historical and political context. That's why Hiroshima Mon Amour is so interesting, because it is precisely not the film she's describing. It is not the morally upright, enlightening movie that says dropping the atomic bomb is bad. Of course that's the case. But there's sort of a stroke of genius to use that, of all settings, as the setting for a love affair. And somehow she makes it work. And I think she and Renee make it work, because they are not only working laterally, that is with this couple having an affair at the setting of Hiroshima, but the dimension of the German soldier with whom she has an affair and for which she is punished adds another axis to it. And that model, I think, if there are writers out there who are thinking, how can I incorporate transgressive love affairs into my writing and make it political? This is it. I mean, we have examples of it, and it's not to be dismissed. You think of like Arundhati Roy's breakout novel, The God of Small Things. That's about a Romeo and Juliet love affair set against the background of Marxist revolution in rural India. So the elements of plot are the same for the optimistic writers and the writers of Undefeated Despair. But I think what the writers of Undefeated Despair do is to also incorporate a very realistic recognition of the actual political and historical forces against which these transgressive love affairs take place. And by doing so, I think they lend even more weight to the transgression. It's one thing to just have an interracial love affair that takes place in sort of, Emily in Paris setting again, but it's something completely different to do that against a backdrop of radical political and social upheaval, which is what Duras does. And so I think that the fact that there may be ambivalence in how we look at that is still powerful, because Duras and Baldwin work with those ambivalences, that as much as revolution tries to provide certainty and clarity, part of the work of certain kinds of writers is to also introduce the notes of ambiguity. Like, it is ambiguous that a 15-year-old girl is going to have an affair with a 27-year-old man. That is ambiguous. It should be. But the ethical awareness of it is also what gives that moment its transgressive and its erotic charge as well.
I'm still thinking about, that just a side note, just the discussion of that film is just so personal. As Viet knows, I'm adopted, and my mother was Japanese. My father was an American, and my mother was 11 when the bomb at Nagasaki was dropped. So she lived about 20 miles outside of Nagasaki, and none of the women in her family could have children. And I spent the last, since I came to UT, taking care of her, and she passed away. But one of the things that really struck me in terms of that transgressive relationship is she married an American. And one of the things that I always found both just fascinating and also just, kind of like incomprehensible was how my mother could marry an American after that, right? And she had been disowned, et cetera. And it was not until much later we were watching this film, and that was the one film she got. Mm-hmm. It really spoke to her because it showed that there was an ongoingness to Japanese life after such a horrific event, and that relationships don't necessarily have to adhere. They're not circumscribed absolutely by history. So I really appreciate
I find that response really terrific because I don't know how many of you have watched Hiroshima Mon Amour. It's a 1959 movie. It's still unsettling and shocking today. It's not a romantic movie. It's not a Hollywood movie. It looks like an experimental movie. It's a modernist film, and yet it's also able to elicit this reaction from your mother, which I think is beautiful and powerful, and a testament to this idea that I think Duras has, Baldwin has, I have, I'm sure Emil Habibi had, which is that we do not have to compromise our ambitions as storytellers in order to elicit reactions from our audiences. And that's an absolute conviction that's a part of Undefeated Despair. I think writers who engage in the what I would consider to be the aesthetics of Undefeated Despair have very high standards. They're not going to try to pander to the audience or to try to figure out a way to appeal to some kind of mass market, but they'll set the standard and make the audience come to them as your mother did come to Hiroshima Mon Amour.
Well, and since we've been mentioning film, a question that was raised was how does political film and or television contest or reinforce memory of empire? I mean, like we're talking about something that's maybe not as overt, but it's still, quite evident.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you one example. We recently screened The Voice of Hind Rajab on the USC campus where I teach. It's only an 80-minute movie. It's really a movie you should watch in a movie theater because if you don't watch it in a movie theater, you may be tempted to turn off the TV. Not because it's a bad movie, because it's an intense movie. Hind Rajab, 5-year-old girl, 6-year-old girl by some reports, finds herself trapped in her own car with the bodies of her dead relatives. They've been shot by an Israeli tank, and the tanks are closing in, and she's on the phone to the Red Crescent Center in Ramallah asking for help. And of course, we all know what happens in the end. The Red Crescent medics are trying to send an ambulance to her that's only 8 minutes away. But it takes all day and all night to get permission from the Israeli authorities to send the ambulance. And the ambulance, the drivers are shot by the tanks 200 meters from Hind Rajab, and then Hind Rajab herself is killed. The movie uses the actual voice recordings that you hear Hind Rajab's voice on. So now, after Duras's comments about the enlightening movie, I've thought about it. Is The Voice of Hind Rajab just an enlightening movie? Or is it something more than that? I'm still too close to probably really know, but I will say that in answer to this question about the political film in the context of empire, I dare anyone to watch this movie and say it's not compelling. Just because it's not a Steven Spielberg movie, or whatever the Palestinian equivalent of a Steven Spielberg movie is, just because it doesn't do that doesn't mean it's not compelling. And just because it's political, it doesn't mean it's not. Would you use the word entertaining? I don't know, what word would you use for something that you cannot look away from? And that's what the effect of the voice of Hind Rajab is. So I'm sure you can point to all kinds of not so great Palestinian movies, but that's irrelevant because I think that's what the Wim Wenders stance is, and it's a very common stance. The common stance in regards to politics and literature or film is to say it just means it's at least the bad literature and bad movies. Yes, true. 90% of political films and books are bad. But you know what? 90% of anything is bad. 90% of apolitical film and literature is bad. But that's never mentioned. Right? That's never mentioned. And so we really should be judging the apolitical and the political by the best of what they produce. You could look at Wim Wenders' movies, you could see them as political or not political. He makes great movies. he is not a typical director. He is the 10%. And likewise, I think The Voice of Henry Jubb is in that 10%. And that movie, and there's many like it, give us the credence to say you can actually make, quote unquote, good political movies that achieve a certain aesthetic effect, but also force us to confront in an incredibly uncomfortable way the politics of our world as it operates now. And it's so easy to turn off that screen, even for those of us who want to watch it, which is why if you ever have the chance, put yourself in a movie theater. That movie theater, room full of people, was totally devastated by that movie.
Well, and we've spent, understandably, we've spent a lot of time on literature and the arts, but I wanted to shift gears given the venue and the sponsors and move to law, right? So, and the quest to law, I don't know why I said law. I'm not sure what I was trying to accent. I think it was Matlock probably or something like that. But much of the creation and implementation of US empire is through law. So as a writer, how can you militate against that, or how can you combat kind of legal precedent or legal ruling?
I am profoundly unqualified to answer that question, I think. That's in my other career that my parents wanted for me. You think about, I mean, I thought the Baldwin quotation about justice was really important. That, you know, once we concede that the realm that we're operating in is justice and the law, we're also conceding to the entire institution and the apparatus of power and assumptions that dictates that. You know, if we talk about the law and we're in the United States, we are talking about living within a history in which racism is already embedded in the laws that we have. So I think that, in fact, you do actually need the artists and the scholars as well, who are able to illuminate the limitations of the law and what it does. Now, we're living in a moment in which this idea of originalism has actually become mainstream in the United States. And originalism is a textual practice. And there's nobody better qualified to talk about the text than scholars and writers, and also about the act of interpretation. So the conservative legal movement, the right-wing legal movement, has had tremendous success actually in implementing an interpretation and a philosophy of the law that is based on a certain kind of interpretive model. I think that's where the contestation has to happen. And this goes back to the undefeated despair part. Right now, if you're progressive or liberal or left, wherever you are on this broad spectrum, it does feel like a moment of despair because everything has been rolled back. But the optimism comes from thinking they've rolled back from somewhere where we have made progress. Therefore, it is possible to roll things forward again. But we have to recalibrate. We have to re-narrate. The right wing has done enormous work over the last, they've been campaigning since at least desegregation to map out this strategy. It's been a 70, 80-year strategy to take back the institutions, including the law of the United States. So we are in a very long-term battle. That's why I think optimism and despair in and of themselves without qualification are not adequate to the task that we're confronting. I mean, if we're just optimistic, I mean, if you're optimistic, are you ready for an 80-year battle? No, I think you have to have undefeated despair. You know, I'm a writer, I empathize. I think if I were empathizing with, you know, conservatives, white supremacists of the 1940s and the 1950s, they were probably feeling despair at what they were confronting. And then they organized themselves. And so even though you know, I'm a writer, I mean, the idea of organizing, of taking feelings and doing something with them, whether it's through the long-term campaign of being a writer and engaging with undefeated despair, or the parallel movements of social activism, political activism, legal work, to me, this is absolutely crucial to recognize that there's a long-term horizon to this, so that if we're committed to the struggle, it's a long-term struggle. And that's why I find the Baldwin, the end of the book, which you reminded me about, I find that actually so inspiring. The book is not finished. I mean, some people might think that's really depressing, and I don't think that, because I think that There's no writer, no activist, no leader who can be so egotistical to imagine that the world ends with them. I'm done, therefore there's no progress. In fact, when we look back at the history of not just like individual icons, but the history of movements, what we recognize is that those movements are greater than an individual and an individual lifespan. So really, there's no utopia here. If you're asking like, how do we solve this by the end of November 2026, we'll solve everything. No, it's not going to happen. And so buckle up. That's what the undefeated despair part is. It is actually thinking not only about our present, but about the next generation and the generation after that.
So, and I have this, I've never been faced with this, but there's this question in my lap that is the perfect final question. But we do have some time for a couple of not final questions. So, like, yeah, just one not final question. So, do we have? Oh, I saw you with a microphone. I think somebody wanted to ask a question. Oh, my stars, like, good. This is the, you can tell that I'm not an actor. I don't take direction. So this is the final question. And I think that this is actually something that's a bit, I think, more cheerful.
More cheerful?
More cheerful. Okay. And it's going to start out not so cheerful, which is, was there any self-censorship when I know that sounds, when writing The Sympathizer, and how committed are you to setting your trilogy on television? See, that's the fun part, right? What will be the final part of the trilogy? And you kind of touched on this a bit, but.
No, actually, when I wrote the Sympathizer, I wrote it from a position of trying to not censor myself. I'd spent 17 years writing a short story collection in which I've constantly felt anxiety about audiences and expectations and so on, and about betraying my family, betraying the Vietnamese community. And by the time I got to the Sympathizer, I thought, I don't care. I'm going to betray everybody. I'm going to try to offend everybody. Judging from the hate mail, I succeeded. And then when it came time to writing the sequel, obviously, for me at least, the thought just passed my mind for an instant, like, oh, should I try to write another prize-winning novel? And I thought, no, that's that's completely the wrong ambition. The right ambition is to try to continue to write from an uncensored place. Who else is there left to offend then? The French. Okay, so that was the committed. So the third and final novel of the Sympathizer trilogy, and let me just say the reason why it's a trilogy is because, I don't know, there's something in human nature about trinities, goes all the way back to the Holy Trinity at least. But it's also dialectical, as Neville brought up. But the committed ends in a mental hospital on the outskirts of Paris. The arch nemesis of our spy, Claude, the CIA agent, has discovered that our spy is actually a spy, and he's come to take him away. That's the end of the committed. The opening of the last novel, which I think is going to be called The Sacred, is on a chartered Gulfstream 3 jet laden with drugs, taken from Paris, chartered by the CIA. Claude is there with our captive spy, taking him into Central America in 1984, and specifically to El Salvador. And I just thought that number one, it would be great to write a novel about the 80s. You can't just leave the 80s to Stranger Things, so I want to write a novel about the 80s. But also 1984 was the year of Ronald Reagan, Star Wars, welfare queens, crack epidemic in Black LA that some people think was engineered by the CIA with Central American drugs. I mean, it's so weird and crazy that these things were really happening, and that maybe some of them were conspiracy theories. But the conspiracy theories speak to the extent by which the imperial power of the United States was embedded and intertwined all throughout all the Americas. So I just think it's a great setting for the drama and the action, but also hopefully some of the politics as well. Now, do I want a TV series for all of those shows? Although, I mean, that's a nice way of asking, am I still interested in selling out? Absolutely. It's a strategic choice within Empire, I think. There's no other way of putting it. The cost of the Sympathizer TV series was, can you imagine this, $135 million. The price of an F-35 jet is about $100 million. So we were a little bit more expensive than an F-35 jet. And so that's what I think about. I think about the fact that, we do important work as writers, I think, but there's a certain limit to our scope for our reach for most of us who are not like, Stephen King and so on. And so the TV series, I thought, as long as it didn't cross certain red lines, that is, we had to have Vietnamese actors who had to speak Vietnamese, as long as we could do that, then it would be worth it to negotiate with the giant behemoth that is Hollywood in order to reach a larger audience of the people who would not even read books, let's say. And what was important there, and this goes back to the idea of the movement, is to find the right collaborators to make this TV series with. And I thought that this was so crucial. Actually, the idea of collaboration is something that writers aren't used to, but the idea of collaboration is absolutely necessary to the theory of social justice and social change. We have to find the right collaborators. And so, we found the right collaborators. Neve Fitchman, the producer, is Israeli-Canadian. He's a white guy, but I thought the fact that he's Canadian offset being white. He brought his friend Don McKellar in as the head writer and co-showrunner. Don McKellar, also white male, but Canadian. Okay, it all evens out. And then Don had worked with Park Chan-wook, who is one of the two most important Korean directors in the world today. And Park Chan-wook's Old Boy was a huge influence on The Sympathizer. So when we got Park Chan-wook to be the other co-showrunner and director of several episodes, I thought this was perfect. And here I'll end. When we did our debut before the audiences of Hollywood, and I was up there with all the actors and Park Chan-wook, and he was asked by someone in the audience, why is a Korean making a film about the Vietnam War? And he gave an answer that could have been extracted from my paper. He said, because the United States was in Korea too. So I think he understood what the project was about. And it was so inspiring to find people operating at the very highest levels of their art, in this case in cinematic art, who also understood what I'm trying to get across here, which is that we're all in this together, in this act of trying to transform the way that we tell the stories of our nation, of our empire, and therefore of our world.
What a beautiful.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kathy. Thank you, everybody.